He understands. And that's where this instruction comes from, is that understanding that just like Jesus faced persecution, Peter's faced it, they're going to face these fiery trials. But that's a strong language, isn't it? Fiery trial. I don't know if you noticed on the first slide that I had on the title slide. It was a painting, of course, from the Middle Ages sometime, but it showed Christians being burned as illumination for the streets of Rome. And this is something that Nero actually did to Christians. So when he says fiery trial, it's literal. There's a part of us that thinks it might be metaphorical to some extent, but it was literal for some of them at some point eventually. Fiery trial is a scary idea, isn't it? Fire is dangerous. Fire is wild. It's hard to control. And he says, you're facing this fiery trial. He talks in verse 16, if you suffer as a Christian, that's key for what he's talking about here. That we suffer according to God's will in verse 19 at the end of the passage. There's suffering, there's trials that are coming to them. I think they were familiar with them, but often for us too. These people who have been chosen by God are going to face great difficulties in the world. If you'll notice in verse 14, he says specifically being insulted. I don't know about you. When I think of fiery trial, being insulted is not like at the top of my list of a fiery trial. But on the other hand, I've had people say things to me that, man, they hurt. Insults can be very difficult, in part because when people say things, they get in your head. The words people use. But that's not all that Peter's talked about as we've gone through this book. He talks about various things. You remember in the first chapter in verse 5, he talks about us being guarded by God's power. Why does he use the word guarded? What are we being guarded from? There's difficulties that we're facing. Chapter 1, verse 6, he talks about grieved by various trials. Verse 7, the testing of your genuine faith, that will be tested by fire in verse 7. He talks about chapter 2, verse 20, if you do good and you suffer for it. We're told about reviling in chapter 3, verse 9, and verse 13, that we might face harm, that we suffer for righteousness' sake, that we are slandered, that we're reviled for our good behavior, that it's better to suffer for doing good, and that even Jesus suffered in the flesh. All of those add up to whatever you want to talk about for a fiery trial, from insulted to death, that might be included in those trials. There's a lot of ways we can suffer. There's a lot of ways that we can be tested. And we have to be prepared for those fiery trials. It's really hard, though, not to think of this. And so let me go with you to the book of Ephesians, the 6th chapter, because it's really hard not to think about what Paul wrote there as he encouraged those Christians. Ephesians, the 6th chapter, and in verse 10, where he talks to them about putting on the whole armor of God. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. There it is, isn't it? The schemes of the devil. We have an adversary. Peter talks about him as that roaring lion that seeks to devour us. He continues in verse 12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. And I may not understand everything that Paul is referring to in those places about the authorities and cosmic powers and spiritual forces, but it sounds intimidating. It sounds really bad, doesn't it? Satan is against us. He has his allies against us, and they're going to try to turn us away from following after Jesus. And we're fooling ourselves if we don't think that we're not going to face these struggles. There are fiery trials. And specifically, down in verse 16, though, he makes this point. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one. There's the fiery trials, right? And I like, first of all, how it's not just one shot. The fiery darts, over and over again, he's going to be trying us. You remember Jesus in the wilderness? Right after he was baptized, he went into the wilderness, and there for 40 days and 40 nights, didn't eat. And then Satan came to tempt him. Luke tells us at the end of his account of that after Jesus triumphed over him in that temptation, that Satan went away looking for another opportunity. How many opportunities? So when we talk about Jesus being tempted by the devil, it just wasn't that one time. How many opportunities did Satan find in Jesus' life to tempt him? If it's like us, it's all the time, every day. It's a constant kind of thing. It wasn't just Jesus was tempted in the beginning of his ministry and then it was really hard at the end. Fiery darts, always coming. Did you notice also in verse 16, he says, in all circumstances, take up the shield of faith. There's not a time when we don't need that faith as a shield in front of us because of Satan's attacks. Keeping those things away from us as much as possible. Okay, let's go back to Peter, 1 Peter 4. And notice some more about this trial that he talks about. One of the things he says about the fiery trial is, don't be surprised that it's happening to you as though it's something strange. Why are we surprised by suffering? Why do we think it's strange that sometimes we suffer? I think part of it is just how we think about God and salvation, to some extent. There's a part of us that says, if God loves me and blesses me and saves me and shows me grace, then my life, even on this earth, is going to be amazing. He's always going to protect me and he's always going to take care of me. And here I am, a good person, and I'm striving to do what's good. And so God won't let anything bad happen to me. Are you familiar with that line of thinking? How true is it? Even Jesus suffered, right? Nobody was better than he was. Nobody lived better than he was. And God cared about him a lot too. But that thought, it gets in our heads, doesn't it? It's easy for that to kind of be there. And maybe it's just the back of our minds. But there's that thing that says, well, maybe we won't have to go through those things that are so bad. Maybe a part of it is God's going to take care of the bad people. I don't have to worry about it. But again, that's not always true. Even the psalmist struggled with that. I almost stumbled when I saw the wicked prosper, is what he said. And sometimes maybe it's just being naive. That we're not mature, we're not thinking through things clearly, and so we don't expect it to happen. And that's why Peter has to say here, don't be surprised. It's not strange that this is happening. It happened to Jesus. It happened to the prophets from Abel to Zechariah. It's going to happen to us. Don't think it's strange. And maybe that's part of why he also says it comes upon you to test you. Maybe that's the part sometimes we don't like to admit, that it comes on us to test us as a part of this. Why does God need to test our faith? It's a really good question. I don't have an answer for it, but He did it with Job. He did it with Abraham. He did it with Daniel. He did it with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He did it with Paul with a thorn in the flesh and all the times that he was suffering. And how many more do we need to talk about? These things test us. In all circumstances, have that shield of faith. You got your shield up? Do you have it ready? Those tests are coming. They're going to be there. God is going to test us. Turn with me to the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews, the 3rd chapter, verses 7 through 12, we have a passage where the writer is talking to us about the people of Israel in the wilderness and what's happening to them as they struggle with the things in the wilderness. And he's quoting from the Psalms. Hebrews, the 3rd chapter, verse 7. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness. The day of testing in the wilderness. Do you remember when and I know it was a long time ago, when we studied about the people of Israel leaving Egypt? God said, I'm not going to take them the short way that takes them directly to the land of Israel. I'm going to take them the long way, and I'm doing that to test them. How'd that test go? Well, it was pretty rough on some of the people because there was, no water. And no water is a serious thing when, there's 1 million people. And there was no food. And that's a serious thing when you need to feed your kids and your livestock. It was a test. God did that on purpose. And he says he did that so that they would learn to trust in him. And when they tested him in the wilderness, what did he show? When they cried out for water, what did God provide? When they cried out for food, what did God provide? And he provided that food, to recall the manna from heaven, for how long? The whole time that they traveled through the wilderness until they got to the land. Don't harden your hearts, because there is testing that's coming. Verse 9 continues. Let's see. Where your fathers put me to the test. They did. They cried out against God and said, why have you brought us out into the wilderness? You've brought us out here to kill us. You brought us out here to die. Why don't we go back to Egypt? It was so awesome back there. Except we were slaves, but tested them. Verse 9 again. Where your fathers put me to the test and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was provoked with that generation. I said, they always go astray in their hearts. They have not known my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. There's the reason for the test. It's not an answer necessarily we like to hear, but it's easy for our hearts to become unbelieving and that we go astray in our hearts because we don't understand God. We don't understand his ways. James put it this way. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet various trials of kinds. You know that the testing of your faith produces, it's there for a reason. And we don't like to think that going through hard times helps us, but it can help us. The testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Let steadfastness have its perfect effect, have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And that's why even in our passage in Peter, as he draws to an end of that passage, in verse 19, therefore let those who suffer according to God's will. Did Jesus suffer according to God's will? So should we be surprised that we're going to suffer according to God's will also? So what does he tell us to do? Don't be ashamed. Don't be ashamed. It's not strange. It's a test. This is following God's will. Why would we be ashamed when we're suffering? Let's face it, the whole reason that the world insults us, as he talks about in this passage, or mocks us or reviles us, very often is because we're not behaving like they do. Sometimes they even claim that the way that we believe is wrong. Sometimes we feel like we're ashamed because the world keeps pointing to us and saying, you're different. And you shouldn't be different. Come join with us. Be more like us. Sometimes it's because we're being treated like criminals. One of the phenomena that, I don't know when it started, but used to be on newsreels, if someone was caught for a crime and they were being handcuffed, they would wear a paper bag over their head. Why do they do that? They're ashamed. They don't want anyone to see their face. When we're being treated like criminals, and sometimes when we're being treated shamefully, it's easy to fall into that trap of being ashamed because of that thing. But with all those things said, the reason we don't have to be ashamed is because we're doing good and we're being righteous and we're suffering for it. So don't be ashamed, because it's not about you. It's not a failure on your part. So you're standing up in your full armor of God, and you're facing those fiery darts from Satan. Stand then in his might, is the way that Paul put it, isn't it? And be strong in those things. I want to talk a little bit, though, about especially verse 15 this morning. In verse 15, he says, "But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, or an evildoer, as a meddler." So here he is talking to these people in foreign places. And it might be easy for people to look at them and say, well, you know, that guy that you worship with, he killed someone. What does that say about you? What does it say about your church? What does it say about your Messiah? So our behavior towards the outside world matters because people look at that. But it's interesting, Peter picked these things. Don't suffer as a murderer. How many of you think murder's right? Almost all of us, right, are going to, no, murder, killing people is the wrong thing to do. Don't murder people. Cain? What does it say about Cain? What does John say about Cain in 1 John 3, verse 12? That we should not be like Cain. Why? Because he was of the evil one and murdered his brother. Why did Cain murder his brother? It says because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. We have words for that, right? There's jealousy. There's anger. God talked to him about his anger. And he looked at his brother and he began to despise him. If you're a Christian living in a different society and it's difficult there and you're struggling with those things, is there a temptation to murder? I sure hope not. Don't be like that. Everyone who hates his brother, John goes on to say, is a murderer. And maybe that's what brings it a little bit closer to home, is that I don't actually have to bonk you over the head to kill you and be a murderer. John says, if you hate your brother, what if the world looks at us and they see what's happening among us and they see hatred? Are they going to see that much differently than murder? And certainly we shouldn't. No murderer has eternal life abiding in him. If you suffer for being a murderer, you're where you belong. So don't do that. Don't suffer for that sake. And a thief. Again, this is an interesting one to me. Of all the things he could have chosen, a thief. What's so bad about a thief? My mind almost immediately goes to Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot had control over the money bag of the collection of Jesus and the disciples. Remember when that lady came and poured the perfume on Jesus' feet? What was Judas's reaction to that? Couldn't we have sold that and put the money in the purse? And why did he want all that money in the purse? A little bit of embezzling, a little bit of theft, a little bit of taking, right? No one's going to notice because he's got charge of it. And who's the crime against if that happens? Why did he betray Jesus? 30 pieces of silver. It was for the greed. It was for the theft. What happens when the world looks at us and sees that we're thieves? Thieving destroys trust. I'm going to suggest to you that yes, Judas betrayed Jesus when he kissed him in the Garden of Gethsemane. But he'd been betraying Jesus for a long time before that. And I'm also going to suggest to you that we can be exactly that kind of thief also. That we can betray Jesus by holding back things for ourselves, just like he did. Be careful about being a theft. The third one he mentions is evildoer. That's kind of the big catch-all category, right? Doing something bad. Any kind of crime, kind of caught up in that category. And he's talked about some of those things. In the 2nd chapter in verse 1, he talks about malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander. Most of us would look at those and say, well, those aren't like crimes, are they? And sometimes they're not regulated. He does say in chapter 2, verse 13, to be subject to every human institution. So that rules out rebellion, being against the government. But maybe part of what he's doing here with using the word evildoer is also reminding us of what he's been saying all along about who we should be. Throughout this letter, Peter has been telling them to do good deeds. Do good deeds, do good, doing good, zealous for what is good, having good behavior, doing good over and over again. He says we need to be people who are doing good. And what did Jesus say about it when we're out in the world doing good? What do people see? It glorifies the Father who's in heaven, right? But if we're out in the world and we're doing evil, that dishonors the Father. And I think that's pretty serious. Now, the last thing he lists of these 4 things that we're not to be caught up in is meddling. Don't be a meddler. Murder, thief, evil, meddler? Does meddler fit in your perception of how bad these things are? So almost all translations will use the word meddler. Although the term is only used once in the New Testament, it's very rarely used in the Greek. So we have a hard time knowing exactly what it's talking about, because the essence of the idea is someone who supervises someone else's affairs. So some take it and argue that it could be talking about someone who's like a spy, a political agitator, an embezzler, a revolutionary. They argue that it could be something along those lines. And then you point to what he already said about be subject to human institutions. And there's kind of a corollary there. And that is more of a crime that fits with these. But almost all the commentators choose meddler. Almost all the Greek scholars, is what I'm saying, choose don't be a meddler. And that's something that's actually emphasized 3 other times in the scriptures, as about how important it is that we mind our own business and we don't stick our noses in other people's business. 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 11 and 12. Mind your own affairs and to work with your own hands. In 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 11, some walk among you in idleness, not busy at work, but busybodies. 1 Timothy 5:13, it warns that younger women learn to be idle, going from house to house, not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things that they should not. And I know that passage is about young women, young widows, but I hear others in that, don't you? over and over again, one of the things he reminds us is that we shouldn't meddle in other people's lives. It's strange that we don't consider this as serious, although it's listed here with it, as murder and theft and evil doing. And yet, Peter definitely sees it that way. And that's because we forget how much damage it can do. Meddling in other people's lives is a serious thing. And that one is more likely to be noticed in some ways by the world as just kind of an everyday thing that they notice about us. Being sojourners and exiles means that the way that we live is different than those around us, isn't it? And if it's different, the way that we live, well, sometimes we're tempted to tell those who don't believe why they're wrong and how they should live like us. They don't have the knowledge of the scriptures. They don't have the knowledge of God to understand these things, but we try to impose our belief system on them when they're not believers. And that's getting the cart before the horse, isn't it? And so we meddle. Sometimes we try to be over-involved in the lives of other, or even brethren, trying to force them to hold the same opinions that we do. And essentially what we do is we decide that we're the ones who know best. And in that meddling, we've exalted ourselves up to the level of lawgiver. And what does James tell us about how many lawgivers there are? There's one lawgiver and judge. And it's God. Just one. So be careful about meddling also. And we're going to stop here because there's more to this lesson about the fiery trials. But this reminds us about how careful we need to be out in the world. Let me ask you this question, though. Peter's talking about fiery trials. What's my fiery trial? And I want you to understand that there was very tempted. I should have put the S on the end of trials, right? The darts of the evil one that just keep coming. Is there a part of you that would ask, are we even facing fiery trials? Our situation is very different from what Peter wrote about. And certainly we don't face the same physical persecution that they did living where we live. It's still in the world very much, but we don't have to face that kind of physical but there's still what he brought up in this passage. There's still the scorning and the reviling and the mocking and the insulting. There's still pressure from our government in various ways to conform to their man-made systems. There's still things out there. And maybe we can look at them and you say, well, that's not a real fiery trial, but is it? The darts of the evil one. Are these things that can destroy my faith? So I'd like you to take some time today, if you can, and look at your life and try to think about what are the fiery trials that I'm going through. They're probably going to be different for all of us. And then I want to take that fiery trial, and I know some of you weren't here for the class this morning, but I would love for you to do what Hannah did when she faced her fiery trial. 1 Samuel, the 2nd chapter, verses 1 through 10. Chapters 1 through 3, if you want to read the whole situation, where she was harassed by her wife about not having kids, and it made her cry and be vexed. She really struggled with that trial that she faced. And her response? Go to God in prayer. Think about what your trials are, and let's go to our Father in prayer and pray about them. Okay, before we get this set up, I need a minute to figure out how to do this. The last few times I have done this, I didn't get to keep my recording.